Good evening, and thank you everyone for being a part of our second discussion with Professor David Lewis, who is in the Political Science Department at Vanderbilt, some of whom I'm sure you guys know well through taking his class or other means. So we welcome him this evening. I wanted to run through a few logistics that you can, and please submit questions via the chat box throughout the discussion. So I will start the conversation with some moderated questions, but we look forward to hearing from all of you in terms of what you might find helpful to hear from Professor Lewis. So please don't be shy, and we will allow time at the end to raise some of those to the group. And finally, wanted to make a few announcements just about upcoming events from our East Coast chapters of alumni. We will have a holiday gathering planned in the coming week, so please keep an eye out over email for that. And it will be a nice way to join together, albeit virtually, for a some holiday cheer as we head through year end. So with that, I think we will jump right into it. Professor Lewis, good evening. Thank you for being here. We are thrilled to have your perspective as we have now, gotten through the election day on November 3rd, but there are still some questions that remain in terms of where we will go from here and what might happen between now and Inauguration Day in January. So we'll start with the fact that we do, by almost everyone's account, not quite everyone, have a new president-elect, Joe Biden. Can you walk us through the results of the Electoral College this cycle, and particularly the map shaped out in a quite unique way, different than we saw in 2016. And so in your eyes, what were some of the surprises either for Democrats or Republicans in terms of the results, and some of the states that proved to be very close, that still are close and experiencing recounts?
Yeah, great. Well, Margaret, thank you for having me again, and it's good to be with everyone virtually. And it is fun to come back after the election, after having this conversation beforehand and trying to predict what was going to happen. So let me give kind of a broad overview, and then I'll point out a couple of, I think, highlights or things that are noteworthy. The first thing is, I think we knew going in that the president-elect was going to do well on the West Coast and do well in the East, the Northeast, and then do well in Illinois. And then we had a pretty good idea that the president would do well in kind of the interior West and through the South. At least that was our expectation. And where things kind of got interesting is, first of all, the president-elect the Democrats had done well in Colorado and New Mexico in the previous cycle, and they had won Nevada. Those seem to have solidified. And then the president-elect picked up Arizona, so a state that he flipped. And so it'll be interesting to see whether that interior West is becoming sort of moving in a Democratic direction. I think it was also a little surprising that that the president-elect did better in Georgia than in Florida. I think that most people thought Florida was in play, and Georgia, as a traditionally Southern state, have been so solidly Republican for a while in presidential elections. So that was quite interesting and surprising. In general, I think that the polls had led us to believe, given the magnitude of difference that were in those polls, that the race might have been a little bit. There might have been a larger win for Vice President Biden and Senator Harris, but it turned out to be quite close, and I think quite close in a way that the polls didn't expect, and so that was pretty interesting. So I'll sort of leave it there, but I think it was quite an interesting race in the sense that the polls really, they were wrong again, like they were in 2016, which is quite interesting.
And on that note, I mean, maybe we should spend a minute on polling. I think if those of us that have watched the news in the last couple of weeks, I think there's been quite a bit of discussion about polling and whether it kind of favored Democrats heading into the election, whether those that were being polled were a true representation of America. And I actually heard one interesting thing that a lot of those that were being polled and accepting polls in this environment were those that were college educated, working individuals who were staying at home and could answer a cell phone call and take the time versus some of our essential workers that were on the front lines. So I'm curious your perspective as to where polling is now, where you think it might go as we move ahead to future election cycles, and just what importance it has, or does it have any relevance in terms of where we are today?
Yeah, those are great questions, Margaret. Thanks for bringing that up. Let me say a couple of things about the polls. One is, I mean, what was distinctive this go around with the polls was not just that the state by state polling was wrong, but the national polls were wrong. They were wrong by a significant amount. And it wasn't just presidential election polls, but it was polls for the other races as well. So, for example, Senator Collins in Maine, every single poll had her losing prior to the election, and then she won with a relatively reasonable margin, which is, I think, somewhat disconcerting for those of us that follow polls. And so the question becomes, okay, well, what's the issue here? Was it that we made corrections in response to 2016, but we made the wrong corrections? Or were the corrections we made to 2016 the right corrections, but there is something else going on that's new and fluid that we're still trying to catch up with? And I guess I think it's probably the latter of those two things. I think that the ways that we made adjustments in the polling in terms of adjusting for mistakes we made with regard to education in the previous go around, I think those were the right things to do. But I think that there are some new problems emerging. And I like the way you framed it, or the way you explained it, Margaret, which is that the fundamental difficulty for pollsters is we want to make sure that we're surveying people that are voting on election day, right? And if the people we're surveying are a different group than the people who are going to vote on election day, we're going to run into some problems. And so then the question becomes, well, clearly there is an issue here, that the people we surveyed were different than the people that voted on election day. So what's the issue? And I want to suggest to you that there's a couple of issues here. And one of them is the one that you mentioned, which is that the people who are willing to take polls may be sort of biased in one way. They might have been biased in a pro-Biden way. And I guess the question is that a sort of short-term phenomenon? And I think your explanation is that it has sort of a short-term flavor to it, which is there's a pandemic, there are people at home, and there's people who are more willing to take the polls or the surveys happen to be sort of pro-Biden, or it could be more fundamental than that. And that's sort of a long-term problem, which would be, is it just that certain demographic groups are more willing to take surveys and respond to a phone call in ways that we're still catching up with? And that would be problematic. We don't generally think that Republicans and Democrats take polls at different rates. That hasn't been the issue in the past, but we do know from some data that people with high social trust are more willing to take surveys, and people with low social trust are less willing to take surveys. So is it the case that people who support QAnon have lower social trust and they're less willing to take a survey because they think there's some big, conspiracy with the mainstream media or something like that? So that would be a first problem, is that, Republicans and Democrats may be taking polls at different rates, and that could be a problem. And the other is sort of a turnout issue. And we don't know yet whether there was a disparity in turnout. Did the Republicans register more voters and get them to turn out at higher rates than Democrats did? And we're still sort of sorting through that. That would also explain why the people who voted looked different than the people that we were surveying. So we're gonna find out. That was a long answer to what was a straightforward question. Sorry.
No, that's very helpful. Thank you. And I want to spend a minute on the congressional and Senate races, which you mentioned. So, prior to the election, there was talk of a blue wave where Democrats thought that, again, the polls were showing they would potentially create larger margins both in the House and the Senate. What really proved to be the biggest roadblock for Democrats here? And we obviously still have the two Senate races in Georgia that are going to runoffs in January. So I guess the first part of my question is, why didn't we see this blue wave that so many were pretty confident in? And secondly, what should we expect from Georgia in January and also in the weeks between now and the runoff in terms of what each party will be doing to try to capture those last 2 seats?
Yeah. So again, I think you've highlighted an important issue here, right? The future for governance is going to depend a lot on, what the outcome of the Senate races are. And what was surprising in the Senate contests was we knew it was an advantageous map for Democrats. They had fewer seats to defend just by, so a third of the Senate seats are up in any given 2-year election cycle. And the third that happened to be up this year, there was more Republican seats to defend than there were Democratic seats. And the Democratic seats that were there to defend were safer. And so we thought this is an advantageous map for Democrats to start. And then given that, the Democrats just had to win, half of the toss-up seats, and they would be in control of the Senate. It turns out, and surprisingly, I think they lost more or less most of the toss-up seats that we thought might be in play. So the Susan Collinses in Maine, Joni Ernst in Iowa, Cal Cunningham or Tom Tillis winning in North Carolina. Those were ones that I think people thought were in play. And, your question is, well, what happened to the blue wave? These results are mirrored in the House as well. The House, I think we expected the Democratic House majority to grow, and it actually shrunk a bit. And that's still a little bit indeterminate. There are a few races still out there. One interpretation of what happened is that that the president's own approval and the president's own performance dragged down his vote share. But people were voting more, particularly suburban voters were voting more against the president than they were against the Republican Party. And so the president performed worse in some cases than the party as a whole, at least in these congressional races. And so that's interesting. What we'll be looking for is the Georgia runoffs, January 5th, which is pretty late, right? Given that the new Congress will be counting electoral college votes on the 6th and be seated on the 3rd. But that will determine whether Republicans or Democrats control the Senate. So we'll see what happens there.
And do you think, what are the Democrats, what are the Republicans' mission in the coming weeks to attack those Georgia races? Do you think turnout will be as high as it was for the presidential? I know in runoffs, we tend to see different dynamics at play in terms of who shows up to vote. And so where do you see that going in terms of where we might make a prediction as to how those seats might end up?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think you're right that in these kinds of races, turnout tends to be lower. The factors that drive turnout, these national races and all the media attention that they get and the money tend to be higher in national races relative to these state runoff races. We're a little bit in uncharted territory, however, because of the unusual circumstances of this election cycle and the enormous amount of money that's going to be put into these races. But the campaigns recognize that this is really less at this point about persuading voters one way or the other about which candidate they should support and more about turning out voters. And so we're going to see aggressive kind of new and old campaigning. Old campaigning would be, if you own a television station in Georgia, you're in good financial position at the moment. You're going to see lots of television advertisements. There'll be some sort of traditional canvassing, the kind that we see, sort of door to door with the constraints of the pandemic. And then you'll see some more of the new campaigning, which involves contacting people through texting, micro-targeting, using people's demographic information and specific ways of getting them on social media. And so it's going to be a ton of money there. So I want to say, if you ask me for a prediction, I would say Republicans have an advantage in these races, just because it's hard to animate people to turn out here where there were quite animated to turn out for the presidential election. And that tends to benefit in Georgia, benefit Republicans. But this is uncharted territory. So we're really going to see how all the work of Georgia Democrats will play out and whether they can keep the excitement up there.
Great. And I think, on that note as to where the Senate ends up, what will Biden and Vice President Harris face in the instance that there is divided government, and that trend kind of continues through these next couple of years? What do you think will be most top of mind for them in terms of policy issues? And they both spoke yesterday about the severity of coronavirus and kind of the presidential transition going on there. So, what do you think the divided government will mean for their administration in kind of the first few days and months ahead?
Yeah, so sort of give you one general theme and then a couple of, I think, just sort of bullet points about my expectations for what divided government would mean. The first thing is, and I think this is less contingent on whether it's controlled, the Senate's controlled by Republicans or Democrats, but when there are insecure majorities, when both parties feel like the majority of the chambers is at stake, they have reduced incentives to cooperate, increased incentives to engage in verbal attacks, and they have increased incentive to focus on winning election rather than governing. And so in those contexts, whether it's Democrats or Republicans controlling the Senate, it's going to be a hard political environment with lots of recrimination and lots of posturing that will make governing difficult. So that's kind of my big overarching theme, regardless of how the election turns out. But obviously, control of the Senate matters a lot, and so we'll see kind of how that turns out. If it is divided government, obviously that's going to limit what the president-elect is going to be able to do in terms of legislation. And so I think it'll change the legislative agenda in terms of the kinds of issues that the president-elect will pursue. So we'll look for, I think, an increased number of areas where there's agreement between the parties. And I can talk about some of those areas where I think there's maybe some room for bipartisan work.
Yeah.
Holding constant what I just said about the political environment we're in. I think it will also mean the Senate is likely to lead in policymaking more than maybe we would otherwise expect, because the Senate tends to be doing the hard work of governing, where the House seems to be kind of more red meat on both sides. And so I would expect the kind of cross-aisle cooperation to be centered in the Mitt Romneys and the Susan Collinses and the Lisa Murkowskis and the Joe Manchins in the Senate. And I expect there to be that'll be kind of where the main legislating takes place. The other thing I'll say before getting into some of the issues is you're going to see the president-elect focus on other forms of governing outside the legislative process, the same way that President Trump did. And we can talk about what that looks like in the agencies and through executive orders and foreign policy and things like that. So that's kind of the broad landscape. Just quickly, some of the issues. I think big tech, like in the future of big tech, is one of these things where I think both parties have some concerns about the power that, they're sort of like the AT&Ts of the modern era are companies like Twitter and Facebook and Google and these. And I think there's some possibility for moves there. I think there's some action that can happen on healthcare. I'm not sure what it's going to look like, but the fate of people with pre-existing conditions and things like that is going to motivate some people. And then, of course, all of the issues of the pandemic, the distribution of the vaccine. I think that there's a financial crisis coming at the state and local level in terms of their own budgets because of a reduction in revenues. People's benefits in terms of unemployment and other things are running out. So there'll be some quick action on pandemic relief, just because in order to avoid a depression, that's going to be necessary. And I think another area would be like criminal justice reform. I still think there's Democrats will be in favor of criminal justice reform, and there's a growing group of conservatives, I think, that feel like some changes are necessary there, whether it's reduction in mandatory sentences or efforts to reduce recidivism, those kinds of things. So those are some of the things.
Great. Thank you. I think it would actually be interesting to dive a little deeper on a few of those. So in terms of budgets, I know you've spent a lot of time thinking about budgets in the course of your career, both at the federal and local levels. What do you think is most at risk in terms of the budget and the deficit, and kind of how we are potentially going to pass another stimulus package? What does that mean both in the short term and kind of longer term for the United States.
Yeah. So I think budget issues at the state and local level and at the national level are going to be huge moving forward. Most immediately, we're going to need to make sure that the government is funded after the current continuing resolution ends on December 12th, which is going to be, that's a big deal. And it's not a foregone conclusion that it will be. And I don't know how hard both parties are going to push to get their agenda through in these continuing resolutions. So that's the first thing. Second thing is the president-elect has to get control of the budget right away. The budget is due to Congress for the next fiscal year in February. And right now it's the budget that President Trump has put together. And so the transition team should be working on fixing the budget from their perspective right now. The problem moving forward, though, is that the full economic consequences of the pandemic haven't been realized in terms of revenues. And so state and local governments don't have the luxury of borrowing the way the national government does. And so state and local governments without federal government assistance are going to have to dramatically cut spending or increase taxes. And that's going to be devastating for local economies. At the federal government level, there's still probably another round of economic policymaking that needs to happen to smooth out the transition related to the pandemic. If not, unemployment will go back up and, food lines will increase and, it's going to, there are lots of people out of work still. And so there has to be another round there. But there is an increasing unease with the amount of debt that the US is running up. We were running extraordinary deficits before the pandemic, and they've only, increased, they've, sort of doubled or tripled since the pandemic. And so there's going to be this tension between when do we get back to responsible fiscal policy, and we still need to spend our way out of this economic crisis. And so that's going to be a big tension. And I think Republicans will take the position that we need to get back to fiscal responsibility sooner than the Biden administration, which has an aggressive sort of spending policy agenda.
Great, that's really helpful. If we think about kind of the first 100 days, I know you've spoken about some of the things that the Biden-Harris administration will attempt to kind of attack and address. But are there certain other, details you could provide there in terms of some of the executive orders Trump has issued? Will those be overturned? Are there other priorities that they will want to address immediately? You mentioned the budget, but what else will they think about, and what is their transition team thinking about currently, kind of as we head into January?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that people often don't recognize is just what an enormous task it is to take over running the federal government, at least the executive branch side of things. And so a lot of what the transition team is doing is process related. And so they're doing that because if you don't get the process right, it's difficult to get the policy right moving forward. And so they will be thinking, of course, and they have been planning, since the spring in terms of kind of day one action. So you're right about that. They have a series of executive orders that they want to overturn, that they'll issue new executive orders to redo. They have some orders put in place to freeze regulatory actions that the Trump administration is trying to push through. And they have a set of targeted legislative actions that they think they can get through pretty quickly. So those things are already sort of pre-placed in terms of policy. But they're also, they're trying to fill appointed positions. They're trying to set up a White House process that makes sure that the president can make good decisions, right? So the president is going to be confronted with decisions on day one that are enormously consequential, that the president may not be an expert in. So he needs to get the right kind of information. They need to have a process set up to make sure those decisions can get implemented, that they have the right communications plan, and they have a process in place so that not all decisions come to the president, and those that don't still have to be made well, and sort of set that. So they're setting up processes. They're also preparing to send in agency review teams to take over the 2.85 million civilian employees and the $4.5 trillion budget that these agencies are spending. So there's a process part and a policy part. Like I said, the budget is part of that policy part as well.
Great. Thank you. I invite everyone to, we have a few questions that have come in the chat, but please continue to submit them if you have others that come to mind, and I will go to those in just a few minutes. I think, something else that would be interesting to hear is just how is this transition really going to take place? I know the president has alluded to a potential for not giving the Biden administration all of the information they need, for not conceding the race. And so, what consequences do those actions have? I think President elect Biden said yesterday in his press conference that not only is that embarrassing for our country, but it has ramifications, including substantial ramifications in terms of life lost with coronavirus if the Trump administration isn't willing to give access to all of the intel and information that they currently have. I know that also he mentioned Vice President Harris is hearing intelligence briefings through her role on the committee that she serves on. But can you just speak a little bit about the Trump administration, what's going on there now, and where I know none of us can predict what might happen in the coming weeks, but what effects those things and could have on the transition process?
Yeah. It's an interesting period for sure to try to take over this massive apparatus with such high stakes, and to have some limits on your ability to do that. So what are the consequences of the president's delaying? I guess I would say a couple of them. Some of them can be worked around, others are more consequential. So as you alluded to, one of the things that is delayed is intelligence briefings for the president-elect and the vice president. So they're getting intelligence briefings, but they're not by the same people that are doing the intelligence briefings for the administration. And so so those things are held up, and those things are consequential. I'll give you a couple of examples. One of the points made in the 9/11 Commission report, one of the things that they pointed to as being a source of problems in 9/11 was a problem of information transmission during the transition from Bill Clinton to George W. Bush. And and if the 9/11 Commission thinks that's important in transition, we probably should as well. The other thing is, and people don't recognize this, is that there was a threat on the National Mall during the Obama administration inauguration, a credible one in terms of a terrorist attack. And you need whatever administration is in place on January 20th to be fully prepared for any number of potential events or threats that are against the country. And so refusing to acknowledge a new or a transition makes it harder for the new administration to be prepared on day one to respond to any kinds of crises. And so what normally happens is you're getting the full intelligence briefings. You have full cooperation between the National Security Council that's in place and the one that will be incoming. And you're doing tabletop exercises to prepare you for potential events that would require an all-of-government response. And that can be a global pandemic, but it can also be a dirty bomb in a major city or something like that. And so you don't want to mess around with those things. That, I think, is very consequential. There are some other things in the transition that delaying is inconvenient, but maybe there's workarounds for. So GSA, that is basically the government's property manager, they normally will provide you keys to empty office space in Washington, computers, government email addresses. They release money so that you can pay people to work on the transition. And they give you access to computer systems that get you into the government systems like the OMB's budget system, but also national security information that you can't get access to otherwise. And then your agency review teams can go in and get the briefings that career people have prepared for them, work in those agencies in advance to prepare to take over. That's delayed, but sometimes you can kind of work around those things informally. People are not working in offices at the moment anyway, so they don't need to be in a particular office space. But those are the kinds of things that are delayed.
Great. Well, we will certainly have an exciting few weeks ahead as we see where this all unfolds. We've had quite a few questions come in from our audience, so wanted to address a few of those. I think first, in regards to kind of the election process, how is signature matching done on mail-in ballots? Is that a simple process, or how can you really confirm that mail-in ballot was signed by the person who was supposed to sign it?
So the answer to that is, my general answer is I don't know. It varies by state. And most of it is done in an automated way, unless there is some unusual process. So yeah, that's all I can say about that. That is not an area of expertise that I have. I apologize.
No problem. Okay. And then secondly, kind of in that regard, back to polling a little bit, but what would be a better way to develop who should be included in surveys if, some of the results we're seeing are off? So if we talked about some of these trends that are happening and maybe those are at play or maybe they're not, what are pollsters doing to revise their processes?
Yeah, it's a good question. At various points in the history of polling, we've taken on new innovations. So there was a period where we could use internet polling, sort of appropriately adjusted to do better than phone polling. I think the difficulty now is that, again, the sort of issue is, can we identify in advance who people are that are going to be voting on election day? And in the past, the best way for figuring out who is going to vote on election day was who voted in the past. But things are so volatile at the moment that it has become difficult to predict with accuracy who's going to show up on election day. And then there are some populations that have been difficult to get and to sort of poll effectively. And so we're generalizing from very small numbers for groups that are increasingly consequential. And I put Latino voters in this category, and Latino voters broadly, because they're quite different from one another. And so I think that where we're going to get better is better models of turnout based on the changes that we're seeing, and more aggressive efforts to reach demographic groups directly rather than using weighting to adjust to differences between the sample we get and the population we think we're targeting. Those would be two ways. Now, I think we're at a pivotal moment for elections where telephone polling is problematic. You have to call 11 people to get one person to take a survey. And statistically, I can generate 1,000, I can get 1,000 people if I call 11 times that many. And those people that end up taking the survey will, I can weight them in an appropriate way to make them look like who we think. But is that really, I think we're all getting a little bit nervous that what we really need to do is make it not 1 out of 11, but maybe 1 out of 5 or something. And maybe the way to reach people is different than phones. Is there a way to go back and, figure out a new way to connect with people to get the sample to look more like the population we care about?
It'll be fascinating to see how it, evolves, and technology and everything plays into that over the course of the coming election cycles, for sure. How do you think the split between, or I guess I should say, is there a split in the Democratic Party in terms of there being kind of the far left versus more centric left? And maybe this, back to our discussion of the blue wave, maybe this proved to be at play. So I guess the question really is, what is your view on the Democrat Party and its constituents, and how they may differ, and what the composition of the party might need to look like as we move forward into this decade?
Yeah, I think that the way that question is asked is exactly the conversation the Democratic Party is having at the moment. So there's a part of the party that kind of held their nose and supported Joe Biden for the presidency, and their belief was that, given the context of current politics and the increasing polarization, that a better strategy would be to have nominated somebody further to the left that really generated excitement on the left. And they would have, I think their view is that the election would have been a bigger blue wave had it been a more progressive candidate that got more people excited. And then there's kind of a more centrist group. I would say the conventional wisdom was basically beforehand, if you nominate Joe Biden, you'll win because the president is historically unpopular. And that moderate group says you're crazy. If you nominate somebody that far out to the left, then there's going to be a real problem for the party moving forward. And that's the debate now. So there was some of the reporting that I'm sure some of the people on the Zoom call read was that in the Democratic caucus in the House, there were people screaming basically, and it was sort of a debate between the moderates and the progressives. And the moderates were saying basically like, you killed us in this election with all of this talk about defunding the police and the Green New Deal. And all that did was drive people away from moderate Democrats and to Republicans. And then that sort of fear drove people away, that, people were not voting against Joe Biden. They were voting against some caricature of the Democratic Party that was further left. But the progressives will say, one, that's wrong, that we can turn out voters if we give candidates that people are excited about. And two, what's the point of winning if we're not going to make some serious fundamental changes to the American political system? And that's the debate. What's my own view here on this subject? Given my age and demographic, I tend to be more sympathetic to the view of the sort of Biden supporters. I was one of those people that said, basically, if they nominate Biden, they'll win. If they nominate somebody too far to the left, they're going to have problems. But that's a hypothesis, and I could be, proven wrong.
Thank you. That's a great answer. And I actually might ask a similar question about the Republican Party. So if we think about, I know there's even been some talk that because Trump performed so well and turnout was so high on both sides, but he did capture a large share of the American vote, would there be potential for Trump to run again after Biden's first term? And will the Republican Party have difficulty removing him as a leader figure? And then secondly, if we think about Senate leaders and Mitch McConnell, kind of what is the next wave of leadership look like in the Senate and in Congress in general?
Yeah. So let me tackle the first of those first. I think what's happening in the Republican Party is just as interesting what's happening in the Democratic Party. And it's an interesting moment in political history in general. I tell my students, there's no more interesting time to study politics because so much is in flux, and what it means to be a Republican and what it means to be a Democrat could change. And this is actually one of these moments where I think that you could see a realignment in the parties in terms of what they stand for and what they're about in the way that, we saw in 1932 or 1896 or 1860. It's hard to predict those things in advance, but it feels pretty unsettled at the moment. So your question was about President Trump and his future in the party. So this I have some data on, and I'll sort of just tell you the data that we have. So my colleague Larry Bartels did a survey where they oversampled Republican voters, kind of rank and file Republicans earlier in the year, probably, I think it was January or February. And a couple of interesting things came out of that survey. The first thing is that more than 75% of Republican voters think that Trump has changed the Republican Party for the better. This is not a party at the moment comprised of people who are instrumentally supportive of President Trump because he provides them, the judges that they like or the foreign policy they like. This is a party that likes Trump, and that's interesting, right? Because it means his influence on the party can be large and lasting. The other interesting fact from the survey is we gave people these feeling thermometers. How do you feel about, these different political actors from 1 to 10? And like 53 or 54% of Republican voters put Trump in the 10 category. Like you could not get higher in terms of their evaluation of the president. And that's not including the people who rated the president a 9 or an 8 or a 7, right? There's overwhelming support, of course, because Republicans love their own president, but like he is by far the most popular, most influential, most compelling Republican figure. And so if he decided he wanted to run again, I think he would be the odds-on favorite to run again. I think his own calculation is that there is no reason not to say that he would run again, because it helps him maintain influence. He's the kind of person that can significantly damage somebody's reelection prospects just with a simple tweet. And elected officials at the state and national level fear being the target of his attention because of his popularity within the party, and they're concerned about being primaried. So I think he's going to be a huge factor in the future of that party moving forward. And then the people that remain in the kind of never Trump category are going to have to figure out what they want to do about that, whether they want to stay or go do something different.
Yeah, it's very interesting. We'll see. I'll be curious to see if he wants to remain that sphere of influence or step back. But it seems to me that if you had that influence, then might as well keep it up.
Yeah. Margaret, let me just start to chime in here. I mean, one of the interesting things too to think about is like, what's the vice president thinking at this moment, right? Like, when they do these early, like way too early, 2024, like what Republican should run for president kind of things. Nikki Haley's at the top. Don Jr. is second. And then somewhere down below there is the vice president. And you think if you're vice president, you're thinking, what's my future plan here, right? Like normally you run for vice president in the expectation that once this president finishes their tenure, that you'll be the odds-on candidate. But Pence doesn't seem to be benefiting from his connection with the president, which is interesting.
And I guess one question after Trump leaves office, do you think that he'll face any further kind of legal battles on a personal level? Where do things stand in that regard? If there were legal actions to be taken against him, is that easier once he leaves office? Do you think he'll have some issues there?
Well, it's hard to say, in terms of, with ongoing investigations, we can only speculate. I mean, my own reading of the facts suggests that there may be some issues for the president. Certainly, we know that the state of New York has taken an interest. So there are concerns. My general sense is that if I had to guess, I would give a more than 50% probability to the president trying to pardon himself in advance of leaving office, and then making the courts decide whether that's a legitimate use of that constitutional power or not. Not necessarily because the president is admitting some kind of guilt, but because whether the president is truthful about this or not, he feels like he's been unfairly targeted already. And I think he feels like it would be payback for, his attacks on the federal law enforcement, during his administration. So I expect lots of pardoning prior to his leaving office. And so we'll see. I don't favor any particular going after the president in the sense of like encouraging law enforcement to do one thing or another. I would favor a return to less politicized law enforcement in general.
Great, thank you. Very helpful. One last question on the transition and in regards in particular to the appointments process, which we talked about last time in our discussion. But I think for those of you who weren't on the call, we talked about that President Trump has not filled all of the positions in the government that he has the ability to appoint to. So think about ambassadors or other members of the bureaucracy where those positions have remained vacant, some as a political statement, of course. And so where do you think President-elect Biden stands in terms of filling those positions? And do you have any information as to how his administration might approach that?
Some of that is going to depend, Margaret, on what you mentioned earlier, which is going to be the composition of the Senate and the Senate's willingness to work with the administration on confirming nominees. My expectation is that even if the Republicans control the Senate, that they will be deferential to the administration more or less, particularly on the cabinet and the high level positions and national security positions. Based on what I know of the Biden transition team and their experience, and many of them having worked in presidential personnel before, I know at least the reporting suggests they've got 600 people lined up already, which is a really, really large number going into an administration to have that many people identified already. So it looks like they're ready to hit the ground running, both in terms of nominees for those high-level Senate confirmed positions, but also some lower-level positions that don't require Senate confirmation. So I think that they will take a more aggressive approach toward personnel, not just because of their concerns for management, but also because they recognize how much policy is made by administrative agencies, and they want to get control of that process.
Great. And we might end with a kind of more philosophical question about just the dual nature of our system of democracy in general. So, do you think there's room going forward for a more multi-party system to be developed, or do you think that we kind of remain in this two-party plus independent realm? Or is there ever a scenario where we look more like some of the European countries where they have 10, 12, 15 parties that are influential in terms of the electorate?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, it is one of the distinctive features of our presidential system that it sort of tends toward two parties. And the logic here is one we can understand. I mean, there have been periods where third parties and significant third parties have emerged. But in general, the system tends back toward two parties, right? So we can remember those of us, Ross Perot ran in 1992 and got 19% of the popular vote in the presidential election and tried to create and sustain the Reform Party. And that persisted for a while and then kind of faded away. The reason it faded away was that the Republican Party adjusted in part through the contract with America to take on the issues that Perot had raised in his campaign. The problem that emerges too for third parties is that if third parties are successful taking in sort of securing votes, they often pull votes away from a party that's closer to them and actually gives a victory to the other party's candidate, right? So if Ralph Nader had not run in 2000 or Jill Stein had not run in 2016, there would have been Democratic presidents. That's not entirely fair because in 2000, Pat Buchanan also took votes away from George Bush and a couple of other states. But the point simply is that, if you supported Ralph Nader, you supported Jill Stein, instead of voting for Hillary Clinton or Al Gore, splitting those votes meant that the Republican candidate won, and the same would be true on the reverse. And so because of this phenomenon of winner take all, it's hard for parties to gain and sustain momentum. In parliamentary systems, you get as many seats in the legislature as you get a percentage of the popular vote. So you can sustain yourself with 5%, 8%, 15%. You don't have to win everything to be able to get some reward. In our system, you have to win to be able to get representation. And so that creates strong incentives for the parties to consolidate.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So we have about 10 minutes left, and I'm just curious, what have we not talked about that you think might be interesting to this group? What are you sharing with students? Perhaps you can speak to which classes you're teaching this semester and some of the questions that they've been asking or topics they've debated, I think would be really helpful and interesting to hear.
Sure. So I'm teaching Introduction to American Politics, and in that class this week, we talked about the transition. So we're talking about the transition. And I'm teaching the US presidency is the other class I'm teaching this semester. And there we're talking about a couple of issues that you may find interesting. So one of the things in sort of a broad theoretical sense is President Trump has been quite different than other presidents, and different in the sense that he's been, he ran his transition different. As you mentioned, Margaret, he's managed the executive branch different. He didn't fill a bunch of positions, and he ran a smaller White House than any other president. And didn't seem concerned with the details of management day to day and said things about bureaucrats. So the president is different in some kind of identifiable way. I think Republicans and Democrats would agree to that point. And then the broader theoretical question is that we've been talking about in the presidency is why is that? Is there a way to generalize about him? Like, or is he just a one-off? Is he just, it's just Trump and, whatever. And so what are the other possibilities? Well, one is some scholars are arguing that Trump is a type. He's a populist, just like Evo Morales or Hugo Chavez or Viktor Orban or Berlusconi, and that his actions are best understood as taking from the populist playbook. And that to the extent that, that Trump is generalizable, that if we elect another populist on the right or the left, they're going to adopt the same kinds of strategies that this president has adopted. So we sort of talked about that. We talked about, or is Trump just ideological, that, Republicans tend not to like the administrative state. They think it regulates too much, it reaches too far. And so actions to neglect the administrative state or throw sand in the gears looks like what other Republicans would do or other conservatives would do, and Trump has just maybe done it more visibly than they've done. And so what we've been trying to struggle with is, how do we make sense of Trump in relation to all other presidents? Is there some systematic explanation that kind of puts him into a larger framework, or is he just a one-off? He's just different. So anyway, we've been having that conversation. The other one is just his public presence is quite different than other presidents. And so we've been talking about presidential public appeals this week. And one of the things that FDR said was you can't keep the public's attention to the note on the highest scale forever, right? Like people just get fatigued hearing from the president, seeing the president, and then it diminishes the president's influence. This president has taken the opposite view, which is that if I keep myself in the news all the time, that maximizes my influence. And so we were sort of talking about the difference between their two approaches and who's right and who's wrong.
Do you think Biden will have, what approach do you think he will take? And as a addendum to that, what will Vice President-elect Harris take? And what role will she have versus maybe what Vice President Pence has held over the last last years of the presidency?
Yeah, so I think President-elect Biden he's very traditional. He'll be a president like other presidents. If follow the same playbook, cultivate his public presence carefully, limit his major national addresses so that they'll have maximum influence when he gives them, those kinds of things. And I expect that he'll manage the executive like other presidents have and staff effectively and try to work with Congress and do those things. So I expect him to be very traditional. I think that one area where there'll be a little bit of difference is that I think that the vice president will have a bigger portfolio than some in the past. That she probably, I would guess, they've had those conversations before she agreed to take on the job. And I think the vice president in this administration has been relatively influential in terms of, the president himself is the decider, but the vice president has been kind of in the room when lots of these decisions have been made and has not been sent out on foreign trips or, doing various things. And so I would expect the portfolio of the vice president to be quite large. What I don't know yet is what that portfolio is going to be. What are the issues that she's going to be given the kind of primary responsibility for. So I'm interested to see that.
And maybe spend just a second on what they could be. I guess in terms of the full range of portfolios, what could she potentially oversee that maybe Pence is not currently or is different than what we've seen currently?
Yeah, I guess there's sort of two parts of that. One is where can she help the current administration and where will she take on responsibilities to set herself up to be a better presidential candidate herself? So in the first category, I would think that she could do things like police reform and criminal justice reform because she's got some experience as an attorney general and prosecutor there that would naturally lead her to be able to work in those areas. And like I said, I think there are some possibilities to get something done. She's got connections from her time in the Senate that might lead to some legislative change. So I think that would be a reasonable one for her. I wouldn't be surprised if she took on some other issues in foreign policy to give herself, to sort of burnish her credentials there and have some role there. Those would be those would be two big ones. It's not unusual for also vice presidents to take on like governance issues and things like that, like a management agenda or something like that.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I think we'll wrap it there. I'm personally sad that this is our last conversation that's scheduled, but we might have to have Professor Lewis back in the next year so that he can continue sharing his knowledge. And as we see some of these issues unfold, I think it would be really relevant and interesting for him to just become the in-house East Coast political expert for the alumni chapters. So I'll give you that title if you're willing to take it on for 2021. But thank you everyone tonight who joined. There is a survey in the chat box that Catherine posted, if you don't mind filling that out so we can make these events as relevant and interesting to you all going forward. And Professor Lewis, thank you for sharing all of your expertise with the group this evening.
It's my pleasure as always. Thanks, Margaret, for your able, you sort of set me up so nicely because you know so much.
No problem. Well, we will hope to see you all soon and hope everyone has a happy Thanksgiving.